For months, the assumption in Washington was relatively straightforward. Tariffs would apply pressure on Canada, force adjustments, and eventually tilt the balance back in favor of the United States. What was not expected was the scale, coordination, and persistence of Canada's response, and more importantly, the fact that this response would begin to generate measurable consequences inside the American economy itself. Because what is now emerging from official U.S. trade reporting is not just concern, but evidence that the strategy designed to pressure Canada is now producing effects that are being felt in reverse, and that shift is starting to change the tone of the conversation in Washington in a very noticeable way. What makes this moment different from previous trade tensions is that the discussion has now moved beyond political positioning and into hard economic indicators that are difficult to dismiss. Now, Janice, the report also has some new stats on the impact of this trade war on the U.S. economy. We heard GDP numbers for Canada earlier this week, manufacturing taking a hit. What can you tell us about the U.S. impact? Yeah, it's interesting. For each chapter, they talk about how the trade deficit or surplus for the U.S. has changed. And that reveals that U.S. goods exports to Canada are down by over $13 billion. And U.S. goods imports from Canada are down by nearly $30 billion over the last year. And the trade and services, things like tourism, those have been disrupted too. Those numbers do not simply reflect a temporary slowdown, but rather a disruption significant enough to force attention at the highest levels, because declines of that magnitude suggest that demand patterns are shifting, supply chains are adjusting, and industries that rely on cross-border integration are beginning to feel sustained pressure. What is particularly striking is that these figures are now being formally presented to Donald Trump, which means this is no longer a peripheral issue, but one that is entering the core of U.S. economic and political decision-making. What makes the situation more consequential is that this outcome is not the result of a single policy or a short-term reaction, but of multiple layers of response aligning at the same time from Canada. The United States is flagging what it calls trade irritants in a new report, and it cites several measures here in Canada, including the federal government's bi-Canadian procurement policy and the decision to pull American alcohol off the shelves. CTV's Caitlin Wilson joins us live now with more on this. Caitlin? Yeah, Patricia. The federal government announced its Buy-Canadian policy in December in response to U.S. tariffs. And while American businesses say they have a hard time fighting for contracts, some point out the U.S. has a similar policy on their side of the border. When it comes to grocery shopping, if it's American, Scott Proudfoot isn't buying it. It's about buying Canadian, but also, frankly, just not buying American. And he's not alone. Many shoppers are still checking the labels in response to the trade tensions with the U.S. It has been evolving dynamically. At the consumer level in Canada, there has been a sustained shift in purchasing behavior where buying decisions are no longer neutral but increasingly tied to broader economic and political considerations. While at the institutional level, government policies have been recalibrated to reinforce that same direction. The result is a feedback loop where policy reinforces behavior and behavior reinforces policy, creating a level of consistency that makes the overall shift far more durable than a typical trade response. Canada is making the United States panic. The real impact of that alignment becomes most visible when it is concentrated within a specific sector. And in this case, the alcohol market has become one of the clearest examples where Canada is crippling the U.S. economy. And so this trade report says that it's really hampering the ability of U.S. manufacturers, businesses to get their products to Canada. So they're saying that they want this removed immediately. You look at the LCBO, for example, the stats show that normally the LCBO purchases about $1 billion worth of American wine, liquor, and spirits every year. But since March 2025, you have not been able to buy American liquor in any sort from the LCBO. And that also goes to a lot of restaurants. Restaurants aren't able to buy any type of American product online. There are other ways to get it, of course, but this report today is highlighting that this is really impacting American businesses, and they're saying that it's an unfair trade practice and they want this policy removed completely. The removal of American alcohol from major provincial systems is not just a symbolic gesture, but a targeted contraction of $1 billion market executed through centralized distribution networks that allow policy decisions to translate into immediate economic outcomes. This is precisely why U.S. officials are now raising this issue in formal reports, because the impact is neither gradual nor diffuse, but direct, visible, and difficult to offset in the short term. U.S. officials are sound alarmed that Canada is not backing down in the trade war which Donald Trump initiated. If individual sectors reveal the impact, then procurement policy reveals the strategy. And this is where the response becomes much more structured for Mark Carney. In fact, most of our clients prefer to purchase Canadian products. And while the Buy Canadian sentiment is one thing, the federal government's Buy Canadian policy is drawing attention from U.S. officials, flagged as a so-called trade irritant in a new U.S. government report. As of December, the BYC Canadian procurement policy requires government contracts worth $25 million or more to prioritize Canadian workers and industries. By redirecting large-scale government contracts toward domestic suppliers, Canada is not only supporting its own industries, but also systematically reducing the role of foreign firms in key areas of economic activity, which in turn reshapes competitive dynamics in a way that extends well beyond individual transactions. From the perspective of American businesses, this creates a compounding disadvantage, and it explains why this policy has quickly become one of the central concerns highlighted in U.S. trade reporting. What is now becoming increasingly clear is that the original expectation in Washington, which assumed that economic pressure would remain largely one-directional, is beginning to break down under the weight of these combined effects. Because when reduced demand, restricted access, and redirected spending occur simultaneously, the outcome is not just a defensive posture from Canada, but an active redistribution of economic pressure. But for shoppers like Proudfoot, decisions aren't happening at the negotiating table. It's happening in the aisle. We need to inflict pain on the United States so that they can understand that this kind of behavior towards their allies is just not on. In a statement, Ontario's finance minister's office says until tariffs are completely removed, U.S. alcohol will remain off the shelves. It's likely all these issues could come up during the CUSMA review, with a deadline of July 1st, when the three countries have to decide whether to move ahead, get out, or land somewhere in between. That statement captures the shift in intent, but the data now suggests that the shift in outcome is already underway, which is why the conversation inside the United States is no longer limited to policy disagreement, but is increasingly focused on economic impact. What ties these developments together is the broader strategic framework being implemented under Mark Carney, which has emphasized coordination rather than reaction, and structural adjustment rather than isolated countermeasures. Instead of responding to tariffs in a fragmented way, the approach has been to gradually reshape the conditions under which trade operates, aligning public behavior, institutional policy, and economic incentives in a way that redistributes leverage over time. What we are witnessing now is not simply a trade dispute evolving, but a shift in how economic pressure is applied and absorbed within a deeply interconnected system where the assumption of one-sided leverage is being tested in real time, because the expectation that tariffs would produce a contained and predictable response is now colliding with evidence that the response has been broader, more coordinated, and more effective than anticipated. And that difference is beginning to alter both the data and the narrative. And that is why this moment matters. Because once the effects of economic decisions begin to show up, not just in headlines, but in measurable outcomes, the space for ignoring or minimizing those effects starts to disappear, forcing a reassessment that goes beyond rhetoric and into strategy. If you want analysis that goes beyond the surface and actually tracks how these shifts are playing out in real time, subscribe to Canada Today, because the real story is not just what is happening, but how the balance is changing beneath.